Welcome to yet another episode of Game of Thrones Abridged on Alt Swift X. Today we are reading another goodie. This is a good chapter. This is Arya 2, A Game of Thrones. And in this chapter we begin to see the seeds for character development, change, progression. A lot of the book so far has been sort of laying groundwork, saying the who's and the where's and the what's, but now we're starting to develop things and move things along. We've got these conflicts, these internal conflicts, these hearts in conflict with themselves that George R. R. Martin loves talking about, which are the engines that are propelling and driving our characters through the plot and through this beginning of the grand story. That's what's happening. And this chapter is Arya 2. And the chapter begins with breakfast, as all chapters should. George Martin lavishes us with a wonderful description of soup. There's pumpkins and thickness and sweetness and blah, 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 blah. But the point is that Arya's having breakfast and Ned Stark, her father, marches in. And Arya can tell that her father is a bit upset, a bit cranky, because he's just been talking with the small council, doing all the politicking that Ned Stark hates so much. And Lord Stark's men are all there, like Jory Castle and these guards. And the Stark guards have this cool uniform that they don't have in the show. They have these wool cloaks, these stark grey cloaks with white satin borders, with a hand of silver clutching the cloak at each shoulder. So they've got a hand to represent Ned being Hand of the King. We don't normally see the Starks wearing such fancy sort of garb in the show, but here they have these spiffy new uniforms. They mention that there are only 50 of Stark's personal guard, which does sort of remind us that the Starks are outnumbered here, that the Starks are at threat. And so Ned is sort of complaining, about politics. And then we have some more food descriptions, platters of ribs, garlic and herbs, blah, blah, blah. And Jory mentions that, everyone's talking about the tourney, the tournament that's going to happen. And Sansa is so very excited at the idea of a tourney. Because a tourney means people and knights and pageantry and heraldry and singers and songs and entertainment and food and all the stuff that Sansa, the young lady, is so excited about. Because, of course, she doesn't get to see much of this sort of thing when she's in Winterfell. Coming down to the south means all these new exciting experiences for her, the sort of stuff she hears about in the songs. So Sansa is overjoyed at the prospect of getting to see a tourney. And so she's so excited that she's going to go get to see the tourney. Father Ned, meanwhile, is less excited because, of course, he's been having to deal with the cost of this tourney and all of the hassle of this tourney being his position. And Arya, for her part, seems sort of neutral at best at the idea of a tourney. She doesn't really think about it. Yeah, she says she doesn't care about it, and she thinks about how she hates Prince Joffrey. Arya does a lot of hating in this chapter. She's got this sort of impotent rage against all the people who have wronged her, like Queen Cersei for killing Lady and Joffrey for lying about the incident by the Trident. She's got all these enemies now, and she is brooding on her hatred for these people. But she's But yeah, she sort of argues with Sansa, and they're sort of at odds, Arya and Sansa. And Arya, she sort of gets into this fight with Sansa, and she sort of blinks back the tears and tries not to cry. So Arya tries to sort of suppress and compress and turn inwards all of her emotions. She tries not to express it. Whereas Sansa, you always know what Sansa's feeling. Well, at this point you do. She also becomes quite good, for better or worse, at suppressing and hiding her emotions like that. Anyway, but Ned is frustrated by his daughter's fighting, and he's not very hungry, so he leaves breakfast. And Sansa gossips with Jane Poole and the other girls about the tourney. The Stark guards, Desmond, Jax, Holland, Harwin, those guys are sort of hanging out, bantering, but no one talks to Arya. And she says she doesn't care. She likes it that way. She likes being left alone. but you've got to feel a little pain for her alienation here. And she talks about how she misses her family. She misses Rob and Rickon, and most of all, she misses John. She wants John to muss her hair and call her little sister. So Aya's feeling lonely out here in King's Landing, which is sad. And Arya reflects on some stuff that Ned used to say about how it's important for a lord to eat with his men among his people, otherwise, because that way you can get to know your people and develop a relationship and trust and blah blah blah, which is important as a leader. And he talks about how he had this custom where he'd always have an open seat, a free seat next to him at Winterfell for meals, and every meal or every day he'd have a different person come and sit in the seat and chat with Lord Ned Stark. And whatever, if it was a horse dude, they'd chat about horses all day, or if it was a warrior, they'd talk about fighting, and if it was Hullen, the horse guy, they'd talk about whatever was the interest of the guy who was sitting in the seat. And so that meant that Ned was able to learn about what was going on in his realm, and the people were able to get closer to Ned and to like him. And so it was this great way of learning and developing important relationships. And Arya reflects on this because, of course, Arya is also very good at being open to other people's ideas and developing relationships and learning stuff. So that's something that's important to Arya's character, I think. She talks about how she loves listening and she loves hanging out with lots of different people. We talked about that in the previous Arya chapter, I think. But she's good at learning. And she reflects on her feelings of betrayal, because she came down from Winterfell, and she believed, so we start to delve into why Arya feels so alienated. So Arya feels betrayed by the Stark guards and by her family even, because of how they allowed Queen Cersei to kill Lady, and of how they allowed Micah to be killed by the Hound, and no one had spoken up against any of that, or fought for Micah, or fought for Lady, or any of those things. People didn't fight to protect Arya's friends, and for that reason, Arya feels like she's been betrayed by all the people around her, by the people of Winterfell, and she also talks about how she blames herself. So Arya feels terrible about what happened to her friend Micah, terribly betrayed. So she's dealing with a lot of fucking angry, complex emotions right now. Meanwhile, she's expected to still be behaving like a perfect pretty lady, which is fucking ridiculous given her grief and guilt and all that shit. But Septa Mordane is looming over her, telling her, "Ooh, fucking use the correct fork, missy." And she's got no fucking patience for that. So Arya does something she's done before, and she bolts out of this ladylike shitty situation that she doesn't want to be in, and she runs off. And so she goes on a sort of a chase scene. It's like Faster Than the Furious 7, because Arya runs away from Septa Mordane, and she runs away from the guards, and she even does a bit of a stunt sliding between the legs of old fat Tom, the guard who's trying to bar her way, and she runs back to her room and slams the door with the big bar down behind it and locks everyone else out. And Arya finally feels safe enough to cry. So she breaks down, she's weeping, and she says that she's hating them all. She hates them all and hates herself most of all. It's her fault. Everything bad that happened was her fault. So Arya's really fucking beating herself up over the death of Micah, over the death of Lady, over everything that's happened. And Fat Tom the guard tries to get in, and she says, "I'm not here," and he leaves, and she's just having a horrible fucking time. But then she thinks to the one thing that sort of seems to give her some kind of comfort in this situation, which is Needle, the sword that John gave her. She goes to her chest and she opens the sword and she brings out the sword Needle. So we see that Arya's strategy of dealing with grief and alienation and these horrible feelings, her response to that is to reach for strength and independence that is granted to her by her sword Needle. Arya turns to weapons, to the ability to kill in order to make herself feel stronger and safer when she's feeling broken and alienated, which is interesting when you compare that to Sansa. I mean, Sansa hasn't quite yet gone into this stage of being alienated and having a horrible time, But when we do, we see that, Sansa has radically different strategies of dealing with her own pain. But Arya's strategy is very much about making herself stronger and tougher and more independent. So Arya turns to her sword needle. And Septa Mordain comes and barges, tries to knock on the door, but Arya doesn't let her in. So Mordain's getting all angry. But then she leaves and gives up. And Arya thinks about running away. She thinks about, I could get some food from the kitchens, I could get my good boots and my good cloak, and I could run off and I could go wherever I wanted. I could go to Winterfell, where Jon is. So Arya's thinking about her response is to leave the situation, become independent, manage her own shit. That's her response to pain. And she's thinking, and also, of course, she's displaying her resourcefulness here because she knows about traveling. And she's still like 10 years old, 9 years old, but she knows a fair bit about how to survive because she's learned from all the people that she's talked to. Anyway, so she's full of all this fucking rage and pain and being strong and independent, but then her dad, Ned Stark, comes and knocks on the door. And unlike Septa Mordain, he is very calm, and he's firm, but he's also sort of respectful, and he just sort of says, Arya, open up the door, we need to talk. So sort of the rage falls out of Arya, and she opens the door and lets her dad in, though she forgets that she's holding her sword needle in her hand. So Ned sees that, my daughter has a sword, which he knew nothing about. He comments about how bewildering it is that his 9-year-old daughter is being armed from his own forge, and he knows nothing about it. The hand of the king is expected to rule the 7 kingdoms, yet it seems I cannot even rule my own household. So Arya's like, so Ned's like, come on, what's going on? Since when are we giving children weapons? And Arya refuses to say that it was Jon. She thinks that she would not betray Jon. So it seems that Arya sort of sees Jon as this family member, as almost the last one who she has this strong bond with, who hasn't betrayed her, and who she refuses to betray. And Ned observes that the sword is like, it's a pretty serious sword. I mean, it's a little light sword, but it's still a sword. It's no toy for children. And they sort of talk about how, Septa Mordain has these expectations of you being a lady. And Arya's like, I don't want to be a lady. And Ned reflects on Arya's personality, and he talks about how you have a wildness to you. You have the wolf blood. And he talks about how Ned's sister, Lyanna Stark, had a touch of the wolf blood, of the wildness. And and Ned's brother Brandon, who was killed by the Mad King, he had more than a touch of the wolf's blood, of the wildness. And he notes it brought both Brandon and Lyanna to an early grave, which might also foreshadow an early grave for Arya herself. And Ned talks about how Lyanna reminds him of Arya, and how Lyanna was beautiful, willful, and dead before her time. All this foreshadowing that Arya might possibly die. And they sort of talk more about the sword and stuff, and then Arya finally lets out and expresses all her grief over Micah, and her hatred and her rage. Well, not her hatred and her rage, mostly her grief. She cries and sobs against her father Ned's chest. And Ned's like, oh, come on, it's not your fault. He tries to console her. He talks about how, the murder of Micah isn't your fault, it's the Hound's fault, and it's Cersei's fault. And Arya talks about how much she hates all these people. She hates them for lying. Joffrey lied. And Ned says, well, even good people lie, he says, more or less. Which is interesting because, of course, we know that Ned talks about the lies that have haunted him for 14 years. We know that Ned has, theory goes, lied about Jon Snow being his bastard when it's actually Lyanna's son. So it's interesting that even Ned, who supposedly is this completely honorable at all times dude, even he admits that even good guys lie sometimes, do things that are not totally supposedly correct, not honorable, not following this strict set of ethical codes. Sometimes good guys have to break them. They're more like guidelines, So Ned makes that point. And they talk about how Nymeria ran off. Nymeria, Arya's direwolf. Arya had to drive Nymeria off in order to protect her from Cersei. And they talk about Arya's bond with Nymeria, and Arya mentions that there are other wolves for Nymeria to play with out in the woods in the Riverlands. So this is the first of many pieces of little hints that suggest that Nymeria is alive and well out there in the Riverlands leading a big wolf pack that Arya might one day reunite with. Because back when Arya's fantasizing about running away, she mentions, I could go and find and join up with Nymeria in the woods. So yeah, it's hinted many times that Arya might reunite at last with her papa, with Nymeria. Yeah, so Ned talks about, sometimes lies can be not without honor, but blah, blah, blah. But then Ned gives a really cool speech, conversation they have about how you are a Stark of Winterfell, and I know you're a 9-year-old girl, but winter is coming. The hard, cruel times are coming. There are enemies around us, and the way we need to survive this is as a family, as a pack. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. So Ned's like, well, if you gotta hate people, don't hate your family, don't hate our side. Only hate the people who do us harm. Sansa, you're very different to her. I know you got all these tensions and conflicts, but you need her, and she needs you, so treat each other as sisters and be good to each other. And fucking get your shit together because winter is coming, is what Ned says. It is time to begin growing up. And that applies not only to Arya, but that applies to Jon Snow, that applies to Sansa, that applies to poor little Rickon. It's that whole sort of generational thing. This new young generation of younger people got to rise up and get their shit together because the older generation's dying and winter is coming. And so Arya expresses her love for Ned. She has never loved Ned so much as she did in that instant. And Arya says that she can be strong too. She can be as strong as Robb. I'll get my shit together. This little 9-year-old girl says she'll do what she can. And Ned says, all right, you can keep this sword. He says, as long as you promise not to stab your sister, you can keep Needle. And so Arya's like, wow, what a fucking great dad. I'll keep my little lethal weapon by my 9-year-old side. So Arya's sort of inspired to stick by the sort of Starks and do the right thing, and her dad's given a very effective, inspirational speech. Speech check, successful. Anyway, so after all that conversation, a while later, Arya does some stuff, and then she goes into a hall after they've cleared out the breakfast tables, and this strange man is there. A strange man with an accent from Bravos or somewhere. And he's a man he's a bald man with a big nose, and he's got 2 wooden swords, 2 practice swords, and he introduces himself as Arya's dancing master. And he chucks the sword to Arya, and this is the beginning of Arya's training as a swordsman, as a swords person, as a swords 9-year-old, as ridiculous as that may be. And it's heavy. The sword is heavy for Arya. The burden that she must bear is heavy, but Syrio talks about how it is as heavy as it must be to make Arya strong. So she will be becoming stronger. She'll be getting these skills by learning how to sword fight. And they talk about how this is not the Westerosi style of fighting. This is not the knight's dance. This is the water dance. So it's a light, swift kind of fighting. The Bravosi, Bravo style of water dancing, of fighting. And Syrio is the first sword in Bravos, which is apparently this special title of how good you are with the sword. And we also talk about how Syrio's sort of philosophy is kind of dehumanizing in a way. Like Syrio talks about, boy, girl, you are a sword. That is all. So while on the one hand, Arya's arc is kind of about, her being empowered and becoming more strong and independent, which seems cool, there's also this strong side of dehumanization and losing touch with her identity and becoming less than human. You are a sword, that is all. So that's something that begins in this second Arya chapter and continues throughout her whole arc. As Arya becomes stronger, she becomes less Arya. But Arya sort of enthusiastically starts to get into sword fighting. She trains for 4 hours straight, and she's sore and aching, but she gets up the next day and does it again. So what this chapter is sort of about is Arya stepping up and deciding, alright, I'm gonna fucking man up and get strong and do what needs to be done and be mature to survive the winter that's coming. And of course, Arya's arc is in a lot of ways about like the consequences of her doing that, some of which aren't so positive. Joining a death cult, not so positive. But on the whole, it is a story about strength and independence and getting shit done. Even if getting shit done might involve assassinating a few people here and there. So, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. We will be doing another one soon. Cheers.